afternoon, we welcome Joanne Nova. She has a Bachelor of Science with First Class Honours and a Graduate Certificate in Science Communication. She's a former host of Y, a children's science program on Channel 9, and had numerous other television and radio slots, including presenting at the moment a weekly spot with Laurie Atlas of 4RO in Queensland. And Jo's a blogger, a very prolific blogger as well, and she's regularly been voted the best blog in Australia and New Zealand. And she's the author of numerous publications such as the Climate Skeptic Handbook, which has been translated into 15 languages. She's given keynote addresses and dinner speeches at national conferences and launches, and we're also very lucky to have her here today. And the title of Joanne's subject today is How to Destroy an Electricity Grid in 3 Easy Steps. So this should be very interesting indeed. We welcome Jo.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming today to find out how to destroy an electricity grid in 3 easy steps. You're probably wondering why, like everyone else, why, and 10,000 engineers in Australia, would you want to destroy an electricity grid that took 2 generations to build, that covers 40,000 square kilometres, and that has billions of dollars of infrastructure behind it? Well, I'm here to talk about the joy of blackouts. Look, you can't underrate blackouts for excitement. In Adelaide, people were left on operating tables in the dark. People were trapped on planes, in trains, in lifts, and it was a crisis. In about 0.17 of a second, 1.6 million people were suddenly in the dark. Now, this is different from load shedding. Load shedding being blackouts that are kind of semi-planned at a second's notice, suburb by suburb. This is when the essential infrastructure of a state disappears. And in effect, South Australia was load shed because there was a crisis running through the system, and if they didn't load shed South Australia, the rest of the national grid was going down in the next several hundredths of a second. So it's all automated to protect the rest of the country, and it worked. Yay for those automated circuits. Now, in terms of blackouts, not to underrate them, because blackouts are useful if you've got screen-addicted kids. Gets them off the screen, yeah. Blackouts can be fun. Find out how much fun 9 months later. And our blackouts are good, well, they're good for astronomy. They're the only time that optical telescopes get to look at the night sky without all that light pollution. Especially good for wood-fired telescopes. And blackouts, of course, I think their best use is that they are the ultimate antidote, the only effective antidote to the ABC. Yes, the only time there's no fake news on television. They create jobs. Unfortunately, in places like Haiku and Heng Shui, which are where we're buying all our solar panels from and a lot of our wind gear. Not Australian jobs, we lose. Research shows people lose about 2 to 1 in terms of jobs created. When we grow a green job, we lose 2 other jobs from the real economy. That's if you're lucky, because every other number is worse. Spain lost 2.2 jobs for every green job gained, but the UK lost 3.9 jobs, and Italy lost 5 jobs for every green job gained. So nobody mentions that on the ABC when they interview an activist who says we're going to create 4,000 jobs in Western Australia if we slap these extra conditions onto our oil and gas. And the ABC didn't ring me up, and I would have said yes. Those 4,000 jobs created, we're going to lose at least 8,000 and possibly a whole lot more. Blackouts and destroying a grid are really helpful with money if you have too much. You can have too much money, and if you've got too much, we can fix that. The cost of blackouts, South Australia's single 0.17 of a second blackout ended up costing $472 million. In Tasmania, they didn't get blackouts, but the Basslink cable broke and they lost $560 million because of that. And that is about twice the cost of building a gas-fired plant. They built the Tamar plant in Tasmania in 2009 for $230 million. So they could have built 2 more fossil fuel plants in Tasmania for the amount of money they lost due to the Basslink breaking. And I might add, they shut down that plant, the Tamar gas plant. They built in 2009. They shut it down 4 months before the cable broke. Maybe there is a God, because it was 100% renewable for 4 months and then it all fell over. The cost of electricity, sorry about the colours on this, it was late last night. I just wanted to talk about, for example, the hidden costs we're not seeing. Things like, this is March the 1st, so it's Friday a week ago. You didn't know it, there was a spike on our electricity prices on the eastern states, in 2 states, just Victoria and in South Australia. It wasn't a hugely extreme day, it was just Friday a couple of weeks ago, we hit the $14,500 limit that is fixed on the supposedly free market. The cost for running electricity for a single day in New South Wales that day was 18 million. There was 11 million in Queensland and 1 million in Tasmania. But in South Australia, it was $61 million that day for electricity. And in Victoria, it was $210 million, the electricity bill for 1 day's electricity in the state. Remembering that New South Wales is bigger in terms of its demand than what Victoria is. So that comes from price spikes, and renewables, people will tell you that price spikes have lowered since we got more renewables, and they won't tell you that we changed all the market conditions in about 2010, which is why the former price spikes, when groups were, I'm not mentioning any names like AGL, were gaming the system. But they're gaming the system again, and yes, we get price spikes. So, the cost of electricity per state, it didn't even make the news. $200 million that could have been used for health or schools or something else, or given back to the people who might create jobs with it. That just vanished in a bonfire of electricity Friday week ago. That was nothing compared to what happened on Jan 24th this year, where $932 million of electricity was burnt through in South Australia and Victoria, just the 2 states. So that's nearly $1 billion of electricity went down the tubes that day, because it was a genuine heat wave, but because of the way our system is designed, and I'll talk more about that later. So 2 states, $1 billion. Oh, sorry, this is from a different speech I give, that slide's in there accidentally. That's from a speech I give on pagan rituals and temples to the sun god. Yes, well, the challenge, ladies and gentlemen, we're in one of the toughest countries. If you want to destroy a grid, ours is one of the hardest to destroy. So it's a major achievement that we're managing to be the renewable crash test dummies of the world. Because we have, as you probably know, buckets of coal, lots of coal, 4th largest coal reserves in the world. It is, I think, about 3% of our GDP. It certainly makes $60 billion at last count, employs about 50,000 people, and provides about 70% of our electricity. There's the reserves around the world. I think we're about the 4th largest in terms of reserves, which may surprise people given that we're the biggest exporter. We're only the biggest exporter. China digs up about 7 to 10 times as much coal as we do, but they don't export any of it. They burn it all and buy some of ours, which puts our position into some perspective. At current rate of use, the good news is we can keep earning $60 billion a year and using it for 70% of our electricity for the next 300 years before we run out of our known reserves. And I say we should burn it all now and not wait, because nuclear and other things are going to take over, and 100 years from now our coal reserves might not be worth digging up, so we should use it while we can. Yes, we are the largest exporter. Indonesia, interestingly, is a close second and sometimes beats us, but mostly it's us in the world. Something like 1/3 of the world trade in coal. This is uranium reserves, another great source of energy, 450 reactors around the world, and we have none of them.
Was that all thermal coal? Is thermal coal?
No, that would have been exports total coal. This is, yes, uranium. So you can see we also happen to have the top, we're up there, top level of uranium reserves. I'll just, shift that graph so you can appreciate. It's kind of ridiculous, isn't it? If we talk about thorium instead of uranium, we too, at least at one stage, I'm not sure if this is the latest numbers, have the largest thorium reserves in the world. Most Australians couldn't even tell you what thorium is. We've got too much energy, too many resources, or maybe we're just really good explorers and we found most of it, could be. But as it happens, with all these resources, more resources per capita than anywhere in the world except Antarctica, we're managing to go from a position where we had the lowest electricity prices. So here's 1955. So 1995, 40 years of engineers working really hard and people paying off debts, building infrastructure, big coal plants and things like that, so that we could get, by 1995, some of the cheapest electricity in the world. Continuous falls in real electricity prices. Well, clearly that had to stop. So there we are, back in 1995. Now you might think, if we're going to destroy a grid, we need to understand what makes a grid work. What is it that makes cheap electricity? So let's have a look at, back in 1995, at what our energy system was working on. Now back then in 1995, you can see we had renewable energy, that's the blue stripe, that's hydro. But you can also see that we were running on coal and more coal and gas. So there's all the fossil fuels and, the amount of wind and solar energy we were using back then to make our electricity cheap is marked in iridescent yellow. In other words, there was none. There was no virtual energy running on intermittent, unreliable energy at all, and we had cheap supplies. This is a really important point in the debate. When we need to knock on the head the theory that renewables are going to reduce prices. And the easy answer to that is Australia used to have cheap electricity, and when we did, it was all fossil fueled and hydro, and there was no intermittent, cheap, free energy from the sun or the wind. If we get any more free energy, we're going to go broke. Okay, so our achievements in being the renewable crash test dummies, since 1995, we are now holding somewhat the top position in terms of electricity prices. This is a US group that did this comparison. South Australia reached the awesome 47 cents a kilowatt hour on their scale at the time. And if we look at the countries down here who are really struggling to get their electricity prices up, the failures in the electricity price game, we can see there's France here, which is 70% nuclear. There's a whole bunch of countries here, and the one thing in common with all these countries is that they run off fossil fuels and hydro, and they have very little wind power penetration. And down the bottom, you can't even see it, is the US, cheapest electricity in the world, 15 cents a kilowatt hour, mostly running off shale gas. So it puts it in perspective. So there's the long history of electricity prices falling in Australia. Then we started our national grid here, got organised and started bringing in renewables in around about 2009 in a major way, and something funny happened to our electricity prices. So why the mysterious price rise? Well, something else was going on in our grid. You can see solar marked in, wind is the green one. You can see the wind coming into our national grid. This is by 2016. It really isn't very much, is it? In terms of the total amount of energy supplied, it's quite small. It's getting larger. Boy, you won't believe how much larger it's getting. This is rooftop solar, the orange, and the big solar plants are marked. I think there's a couple of spots there and there. Big solar thermal plants that are, going to change the world. We always hear. They're not yet. The reason for this is the RET, not because these things are economically competitive, not because the market wants them. Whenever any country cuts the subsidies to wind and solar, the market, the investors just run and they disappear. What we've had, despite all the cries of we need certainty from both sides of politics, what certainty means is certainty of profits for renewable companies, not certainty of provision of electricity, not certainty of cheap prices for the consumer. It just means that certainty for those companies that cannot compete economically unless they're subsidised. And here's the subsidy of one of them, there's several. This is the RET since 2001. It was brought in by a Conservative government at a very low rate, but it's been inexorably increasing. That is certainty for you. Every year, going up by 1 or 2%, mandated by law, and now 16% of our electricity comes from intermittent, unreliable and uncompetitive sources, and it's heading higher. And so, of course, are prices. The RET. And just to put this in perspective, the position we're in now, we're in the death spiral. This is solar installations in Australia. You can see we had almost none back when Kevin Rudd was PM, and that has risen from, was 50,000, now we're up to 10 million, which 10 gigawatts of solar, and you can see we're on the very dangerous steep end of that curve. Why? Because you almost can't afford to not have solar, but solar's subsidised by people who mostly don't have solar. So people who don't have solar, their bills are rising to pay for the solar installations. About half the cost of every solar installation comes from other people's electricity bills. It's buried in the bill. I wish there was free labelling on that bill. You know, we expect our food to come labelled with, includes wheat and whatnot, but our electricity bills don't come labelled with, here's your renewable bill this week, here's your bill for solar installations around you that you didn't put on your roof. So those people can get cheaper electricity, and when Australians find out about this, they're going to be furious. So right now we're in that death spiral end. What will stop it? The government's got to change the rules, or the RET is going to run out eventually. This is a graph that should be just deadly all round Australia to the argument that renewables are cheap. This is graphed countries in the world and their renewables amount, and you see Australia punches above its weight here. We've got less renewables and higher prices than everyone else on the line. Partly that's because other people have mountains and hills and they can have hydro. We have some hydro, but other countries have more hydro than we do. If you take hydro out of this graph, which you and Means did, you can see the line gets nice and tight. So hydro was the kind of noise factor there, because hydro actually works. It is economic and it competes without necessarily getting subsidies. But this is wind and solar, just wind and solar, and the more you have, the higher your prices will be in every country around the world. The other deadly argument we need to make more of is to simply say there is no country in the world that has a lot of wind and solar and is cheap for electricity. Not one. Where is it? This country, this mythical thing that runs off free wind and solar. Subsidies. It takes a lot of money to wreck a grid. You might think these things would fall apart by accident, but actually it takes a real effort to destroy a grid. We have spent, sorry, I know you can't read those details, but we've spent around $5 billion a year, and this was a few years ago, so it's possibly worse now, $600 a household per year on subsidising renewables. Do the Australian public know? Would they vote for this if we had a plebiscite on would you like to pay this much money to install more wind and solar in the hope that your 130th birthday party will be 0.01 degrees cooler? Maybe the Australians might not vote yes for it. Now, if you're going to destroy a grid, step one in it is to take your infrastructure that you spent 30 years building up, or 2 generations, and to repurpose it. This, you might think, was a plant for generating electricity. But if you were wiser and more modern, you would know that this is not an industrial electrical generation plant. Its prime purpose is a climate controller. If you want to stop storms and floods and droughts, you really need less of these and more of other things. So this apparently causes floods, droughts, bad weather, pretty much any kind of weather you can think of that you don't like. This is responsible. So once you decide that your electrical generation system is going to change the weather, you've got a perfect recipe for wrecking your grid. So floods, and the answer is not coal plants, which cause them apparently, but putting in more of these. Because if you install enough of these, you might make storms slower 50 years from now. That's why we're doing it, isn't it? I mean, ultimately, they don't say that, but join the dots on the debate. At one end of the debate, they're saying we've got to reduce CO2 so we get better weather. How do we reduce CO2? Well, we need more wind and solar. So the reason we're putting these in is so we get nicer weather. And we think we're modern. This is just like pagan witchcraft. I mean, really, how many Australians do you think, if you said hands up, I want to ask you, how many windmills do you need to install to stop floods in Bangladesh? And what do you reckon they would say? Exactly. When will someone do that survey? Step 2, if you want to reduce CO2, you don't just pick the sensible way of doing it, which is nuclear. You pick intermittent, unreliable, uneconomic ways. This will really wreck your grid. So here's wind during August 2015. Sorry, the black line here is the average of what was 46 wind-powered stations then. And you can see pretty much twice a month, we're looking at a bottom, maybe 3 times. We're getting 3% of the total capacity. Right now our wind is over 5 gigawatts of power. But at any one day, you can only guarantee you'll get 3% of that. It's like having a car in the garage that only drives 3% guaranteed of the time. So you have to own another car which works all of the time as you back up. And somehow we think that's going to be cheaper than owning one car that works all the time. You get my point? It's kind of strange, isn't it? This idea that we're going to make things cheaper. On the East Coast, you might think having lots of windmills will neutralise and average out and we'll end up with cheap, reliable power. If you put more windmills in, won't that mean it's blowing somewhere? Not with our weather systems. You can see here, when we get one of these classic highs across Australia, the entire eastern states pretty much grounds to a halt. Wind power, that's when it hits 3%, when we get one of these kind of highs in the system. Without installing another mountain range in the middle of Australia, we really can't change that. This in South Australia is a sad situation. Now, we've got so much wind in South Australia where we have to curtail it. These are the curtailments, the black parts. All of that is when they just simply say, oh, pull out the plug. We've got too much wind for the system, but we're still installing more. So this is the power station you have when you want to turn it off 10% of the time. Solar power, you might think in sunny Australia would work, guaranteed and reliable at least at midday. Even that's not true. Here's a cloud bank across Australia, and you can see the whole eastern seaboard here is dealing with lower production of solar. On a day like that, about 1 gigawatt of solar just goes, just gone. It's like half your average large coal plant just decided to stop working without notice. And briefly, quickly, this is daily use of electricity. So this is the early hours of the morning. It rises a bit of breakfast. Then this is the solar input in California coming each year as they install more solar. The midday solar effect takes out the need for electricity, but solar's not helpful at dinner time when the electricity grid peaks. So this is called the duck curve, technically, because it looks like a duck. Can you see the duck head, belly, tail? So year after year, more and more solar eats away at this. But remember, this is part of the base load curve. We've got the equipment to make electricity then. All that solar is surplus to what we already have. We didn't actually need that infrastructure to produce electricity then. Peak time is always when solar's not working. Handy that. Breakfast and dinner when you don't have solar. This is South Australia, smaller duck curve. And you can see here that it's about half of the electricity use is coming from solar in the middle of the day. But this is the price. It's at $50 a megawatt hour. Now, to put that in perspective, 6 years ago, the average price across the whole eastern grid was $30. So even when solar's in, the price is falling, but it's not falling as low as it was 6 years ago when we didn't have that much solar. So it's an illusory saving. We've saved on fuel, a little bit less gas and coal is used then, but we haven't saved on infrastructure, we haven't saved on capital costs, we haven't saved on salaries, and we haven't saved on maintenance. And then we pay a bit more, for the ramping at the end here. We have to ramp everything back up as solar disappears, and that costs more, so we're spending more on the winds. So it's a totally illusory saving, the solar one. Now, somehow someone thought, once we built up this infrastructure, that works and supplies all the electricity we need, that things would get cheaper if we made lots of other infrastructure that works sometimes. And then we added even more. Now, wind works about 30% of the time, solar's capacity factor is about 17% of what it's rated as. If you build 100 megawatts of solar, you get about 17 megawatts of energy. It's illusory, that thing. That's an average. What you might get is a lot or nothing, especially at night time. Unless you're in Spain. Everybody's heard the story of the Spanish solar that worked at night. That was a great success of people going, I'm going to get paid a subsidy for solar energy, so I'll pay for diesel generators to operate lights at night. And yet they did. Seriously, they got money for operating and getting solar rebates at night. Yes, give them credit. Yeah. Okay. All right. For the moment, lastly, ladies and gentlemen, you need big government if you really want to wreck a grid. You can't do it state by state. Without big government, all the states ran separate grids. It worked. And across that eastern seaboard, at least, all around there, to really wreck a grid, you've got to get the right person in charge of a national grid, which is Audrey Zibelman in this case. She says, I believe we're the last generation on Earth who can do something about climate change. It's a priority, not getting cheap electricity to you. And she also said technology has changed, and resisting this change is like trying to resist the internet. Hands up, who remembers the 1990s? All those payments. Remember when the internet was just starting? And they had to pay us to use the internet or it would never have got off the ground. Yeah, exactly. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what you get for government control an electricity system. Thank you.
So because we were running over time with the last one, we'll just have a chance for one, maybe two questions, depending on how fast you are.
Yes.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Have you considered the implications of the coal, the thermal plants heating up, cooling down outside of design specifications with respect to that they fail faster? Have you considered that in your analysis?
Yeah, well, yeah, I could keep talking, but yes, running a coal plant when you've got intermittent energy coming and going is like driving a car in the city. You know, your mileage per gas, per kilometre, when you're in the city is really low compared to the country. Those old coal plants are designed to run flat out and 90% of the time or 95% of the time at just full speed. And that's when you get cheap maintenance costs. So the illusion with renewables is that we're going to save money on fuel. But we spend more on maintenance, more on staff, more on resources, more on infrastructure, and more on land. Everything else goes up and somehow we think it's going to be cheap.
I'm just wondering where Western Australia fits into this national energy situation.
Well, we're lucky that we're disconnected from the national grid, but we've got a small grid and it could get wrecked even easier than the big one, and we sure hope the EPA doesn't get to run our grid, because if they do, we'll be really in trouble. We've got a government monopoly over here, so it's very different, not that there's much competition on the east. But our grid is small, it's mostly gas, and the deal that Barnett did to get cheap domestic gas from the Northwest Shelf, kind of not really a free market on that one. We're losing money on the exports of gas, but we've got slightly cheaper wholesale prices of electricity. Unfortunately, the price for electricity here is set by the government effectively, so it doesn't matter that we get cheaper gas. We're paying 28 cents a kilowatt hour here, which is pretty much the same, I think, as New South Wales and Victoria. Victoria's probably ahead of us, actually, above us. So it's a strange market over here. Very few people are looking at it, so I'll be very interested in a new study I think is coming out from Mancal or CIS, are looking at the West Australian grid. It's really flown under the radar. There's very little analysis of what goes on over here. The price is set by the government effectively, by how much pain they think they can inflict.